La pandemia nos cambió la vida. No sabemos cuándo va a terminar ni cuáles serán sus efectos. Por lo pronto, nuestra vida cambió radicalmente y en medio de la incertidumbre necesitamos entender. Justo de eso se tratan las conversaciones CIDE, de entender. En medio de la incertidumbre y desde miradas plurales.
Muy buenas noches a todas, a todos. Bienvenidos a Conversaciones CIDE. Voy a pasar al inglés. Tenemos un invitado de lujo esta noche. We have a very distinguished guest this evening, former Senator Jeff Flake of the United States Senate. I want to warmly welcome you, Senator Flake, on behalf of CIDE and our colleagues and partners of the Arizona State University Convergence Lab. We have a great panel this evening. I will introduce one by one of the panelists. My colleague Daniela Stevens of the Department of International Studies at CIDE, who's an expert on climate change issues and who earned her doctorate at American University in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Dr. Stevens. Welcome, Daniela.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Thank you for having me.
We also have Dr. Andres Martinez, who is a key advisor to the president of Arizona State University, Dr. Michael Crow, and who also does a great deal of work on journalism and is a practice professor at the Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Andres already participated in Conversaciones CIDE last edition, last fall. So it's always great to have you, Andres, and I want to express our appreciation to Arizona State University and Convergence Lab for this opportunity to work together and to discuss binational issues such as the one that we will be discussing this evening. Thank you, Andres, and thanks Mia Armstrong at the Convergence Lab. And I also want to say a few words on our very distinguished guest this evening. Former Senator Jeff Flake served in the United States Senate from 2013 to 2019, and he had served 12 years in the House of Representatives in his home state of Arizona. Senator Flake did his academic work at Brigham Young University. And most recently, he published a book under the title of Conscience of a Conservative, a rejection of destructive politics and a return to principle. And that is the issue, the central issue that we're covering this evening. Political polarization. Is there a way back? So the way we're going to engage in this dialogue, and I guess I'll introduce myself, Carlos Heredia, Professor of International Studies at CIDE, who will be your moderator this evening. So the central topic of the discussion this evening, we'll start with an exchange with Senator Flake and then invite the other panelists to jump into the conversation and then open it up to engage in a dialogue with all the participants this evening. So I want to start telling our audience and maybe asking you, Senator Flake, to tell our audience what is the central message of your book, of the Conscience of a Conservative book. Let me just put forward a couple of ideas that I gathered from a brief overview of your book. You describe the symptoms of political polarization. In describing the dysfunctional system, the political system of the United States, you convey three important messages. as I understood. The first one is that in politics in the United States, it seems that it is better to build and maintain a majority by using power rather than persuasion. The second message is, in the United States, it is often to put party over country. And the third message is, there are many people on both sides of the aisle who think this is a good model on which to build a political career, destroying, not building. Of course, this is not exclusive to the United States. It happens in Mexico a lot. But I want to start, Senator Flake, by asking you, in your own words, of course, you're the author of the book, and you have written extensively on the central topic of this conversation. How did we get here? How did we get to this level of political polarization?
Well, great. Well, a lot of people will trace the situation that we have today to the election of Donald Trump. That certainly accelerated something that was frankly already happening. And I spent 18 years in Washington and really kind of saw the country go in this direction almost that entire time. I think if there's an author to this, it's probably, if you're looking at individuals, it was likely Newt Gingrich during the 1990s, who was much better as a campaigner than he was actually governing. And he was kind of the author, the forerunner of kind of the politics of personal destruction, if you will, where this new model that you don't gain any ground politically by talking about reaching across the aisle or working with the other side. I often say that it used to be that that would get you accolades and praise in a campaign to say that you've passed bipartisan legislation or you've worked with the other side. Now all it gets you is a primary, exactly. Somebody challenging you in the primary, and so we've really gone that direction. It certainly accelerated in the past few years, but I've noted it during my campaign, and it started really before I got to Washington. I got to Washington in the year 2000 or 2001, just when Newt Gingrich left office. And then you saw, Tom DeLay and some of the other leaders of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives really go further down this road. But boy, we are in it today. And if you see some of my colleagues who are far more concerned about where they stand with the former president in terms of getting an endorsement, than saying, hey, I'm going to work on legislation, I'm going to legislate, I'm going to do what members of Congress do. It's more often than not that you build a campaign not by actually moving legislation, but by getting in front of a TV camera and by demonstrating to your constituents that you are right solidly with them. So there's very little political currency these days for bipartisanship, and that's what we need to change.
But back in 2013, I remember you were part of the so-called Gang of Eight, which were senators from the Democratic Party, to work on an immigration reform. And you, not only talked to across the aisle, but
yeah, you're cutting out a bit there, but I'll go ahead and so yeah, I was part of that group, and that's one of the last examples we've had in the Senate, in particular, where we've had the Senate actually work like the Senate used to work.
You did pass that bill in the Senate.
Yes, we did, 68 to 32, and like I said, it's one of the last examples. Go ahead, but these days, I think it's instructive to talk about what happened after that. We passed it out of the Senate, but then the House didn't take it up. One of the majority leader in the House of Representatives, Eric Cantor, lost his primary race. And the perception was, I don't think it was a reality, that it was because he was a little too forward thinking or too liberal, if you will, on immigration. And so people ran scared. And even some of those who were involved in the effort, notably Marco Rubio, doesn't hold the same position today because the party has moved in a different direction. But that was one of the last examples of a group of Republicans, a group of Democrats negotiating a bill. In this case, it took 7 months. And we produced what I still believe is a real good product. And whatever immigration reform we have moving ahead, we'll use a lot of what we did as a template, but it's tough to see that moving today.
Yes, that's what I was going to ask you. With the Senate being equally divided, do you anticipate that there will be progress in President Biden's proposal for a comprehensive immigration reform moving ahead?
No, I would like to say otherwise. Let me just say that during my 18 years in Congress, there were several items, like, for example, the DREAM Act, as a way to deal with what are now called the DACA population or DACA kids. That's something we could have, taken out on its own and moved it. There was plenty of bipartisan support for that, or certain high-skilled immigration visas. There were some parts that we could have moved on their own, but we kind of held back on those to use them as sweetener for the other items that we needed to get. Now it would be very difficult to move any one of those items on their own. I just don't see where the Republican support is right now for even just dealing with the DACA population, particularly as long as the courts just allow the current program to continue. There's no reason for Congress politically to get involved. And so it makes it very difficult to move ahead on an issue like that.
Right. So we've approached political polarization. Let me jump to another subject that is also related, cultural polarization. I have heard people say that the mother of all polarization is the racial polarization, is the color of your skin. I remember a speech by Attorney General Eric Holder in the Obama administration, in which he said that that they call it a nation of cowards, because he said the United States is very hesitant to even talk about the racial divide, which is a big polarization in everyday life. What is your sense of that, Senator?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I think when you understand the appeal that our former president, President Trump, had in my party, that was at the root of a lot of it. It was a concern that people, particularly the white older population, has about the country changing culturally, about demographics simply changing. And that is at the root of a lot of the appeal, frankly, of a Donald Trump. Now, in my view, that puts us in frankly, a demographic cul-de-sac where there's just no way out. I think it's aside from being wrong on the policy front, it's politically, it's suicide for a party to go down there. But that's kind of where we are, and it's very concerning to many of us.
Okay, to many people outside the United States, Senator, it is very difficult to understand how lawmakers would endorse the assault on Congress that happened on January 6th. How would anybody who serves in the Congress approve of that?
Well, nobody will admit that they approve of it, and certainly I don't suggest that any of my former colleagues approved of what happened. But the president, in my view, used, insightful language. He was very much responsible, as so many on the left and the right have, I think, appropriately said. And if my party, many were guilty of amplifying the president's falsehoods about a rigged election. And that's what was at the root of this, is people who ultimately believed that, or wanted to believe that, and felt that whatever action they took would be justified because the president was being robbed of an election that he actually won. So, I mean, you won't find anybody trying to justify what happened at the Capitol, but when you have 147 Republicans in the House of Representatives actually voting to put the election aside and to basically put the electors aside and have the Congress decide who the next president would be, then that's certainly what caused this assault to happen. But nobody will admit to actually wanting this to happen.
I know. Thank you for making the record straight on that. But I still see that on one hand, the Democrats claim the moral high ground now, and the Republicans claim to be the party of law and order. So I guess those two, labels may not apply anymore, and I guess the political dispute that's in a very polarized environment will have to seek how to reconnect with the people. It seems that people are not getting enough answers, Senator.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's tough to make the case that my party is the party of law and order when people who are supporting the president were using these Trump flags in some cases to beat Capitol policemen up with. But my side of the aisle, Republicans will point to what happened during the summer and say that Democrats were far too willing to allow the riots that occurred across the country. And so both parties are kind of pointing at each other. And so I think we can do much better. I frankly think the President Biden has done a good job on that front. Certainly not giving in to some of the rhetoric of the left, defund the police and this kind of thing. But my side of the aisle, we still need to do a lot better because there is still too few of my colleagues who will admit that this was a free and fair election. They don't want to be on the other side of the president.
Only 6 in the Senate. Am I right?
I'm not sure the number, but far too few are willing to admit that. They just don't want to be on the other side of the so-called base or Republican primary voters. Right. So, and as long as they won't do that, we're going to have trouble. That ought to be easy. There are certain things that should be easy in politics, and should be something that's expected of us, and to accept the will of the voters, and to accept when an election is free and fair. That ought to be right at the center of what we're all about, Republican or Democrat.
Okay, Senator, let me widen the dialogue here and invite our other panelists to jump into the fray. And I'm now going to ask Dr. Daniela Stevens on another issue that is also the subject of great polarization, and that is energy and climate change. In Mexico, the federal government advocates a continuation of the use of fossil fuels. While in the United States, President Obama is pushing for a transition towards clean energy and the use of renewable energy. How do you see that contrast? How do you analyze that contrast? Because we also had the polarization under President Trump, who was a fervent supporter of the use of coal, for example. Now they have shifted gears in the United States, but here in Mexico, the government is still advocating a path that implies the use of fossil fuels. What is your analysis of this polarization, Dr. Stevens?
Thank you again for having me, Carlos. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. Well, many of us are wondering, like you, if there will be some sort of recalibration between the bilateral relationship, especially in the energy sector. And as the title of this conversation indicates, if there will be a way back. Because Biden started his presidency with an energy concern, which was paradoxically the exact same concern as the Trump administration had once it left power, that the Lopez administration failed to comply with the agreements that he acquired with the private sector in energy projects in his eagerness, as you are saying, to favor the state energy company CFE. Since the 2018, when he took office, Mexico has had increasing difficulties with international investors, given AMLO's measures to strengthen state-owned companies. And several actions have already affected very negatively renewable energy projects that are largely privately owned. I agree, as many analysts report, that there will be a return to institutionalized bilateral relations, but regardless of such institutional relations, it'll be difficult to find a middle ground on energy issues. It'll be difficult to have a consistent cooperation in the field of clean energies and in the field of climate change. Since October of last year, the US Congress denounced the environment of uncertainty in Mexico. In fact, the outgoing administration also sent a letter to their counterparts in Mexican secretariats, including, of course, the Secretariat of Energy, of Foreign Relations, because of the pattern of obstruction that was already taking place. In other words, both administrations and both the executive and the legislative branches in the US are already warning, and were already warning last year of an interference with the spirit of the free trade agreements, especially the USMCA that we have in place since July. At the time, Trump didn't pay that much attention. He did very little to pressure López Obrador on his energy policy because he prioritized that Mexico contain undocumented immigration. It was some sort of tit for tat that the last administration didn't pay that much attention to the investment environment. But Biden and his government are expected to react to the demands of the affected investors and the concerns of members of Congress. Industry groups and even other foreign powers hope that the Biden administration will take a firmer line in defending the business interests and also, as you say, climate change interests. On the other hand, AMLO has insisted that he will not change the country's energy policies. So we're in a conundrum.
Right. Thank you, Daniela. So we've talked of a transition at the federal level, at the national level. I'm now going to turn to Dr. Andres Martinez and ask him to give us your insight, Andres, and on another transition, how Arizona, the state of Arizona, was flipped in the 2020 election. How did it go from being a red state to a blue state, albeit by what, 12,000 votes? But give us your insight on that transition, because we're describing a very polarized scenario, and yet there are the cases of Arizona, Georgia, and also the Midwestern states that were flipped. So Andres.
Yes, thank you, and thanks again, Carlos, for having me and us. And we're very excited to have this ASU CETA collaboration, and I'm also really excited that Senator Flake has joined us, and he is a distinguished dean fellow at ASU this right now. So I'm honored to be able to call him a colleague, and somewhat intimidated talking about trying to analyze Arizona politics in front of him because he knows.
I'm going to get back to him to ask his insight.
Also, harkening back to the previous conversation, if I could open a parenthesis, I just want to say that I was at the New York Times a long time ago, and Senator Flake was then in the House of Representatives, and I first called you to interview you. I was on the editorial board, and we talked about an effort to unwind and reverse the embargo on Cuba. And I think that's a good example of very constructive alliances, and they still take place in Washington, but they're becoming harder and harder to pull off, as the senator was alluding to, particularly on a high-profile topic. And I think Senator Flake was a very principled conservative with a libertarian bent, if I can put it that way, and was offended that the U.S. government was telling people where they could travel to and not. So the embargo was very offensive. And you were in alliance with a lot of very progressive groups who had a very different reason for opposing the embargo. And that was a really interesting kind of coalition building that was part of what we were talking about is becoming much more difficult. On Arizona, yes, Arizona was one of the, there were very few states that changed from 2016 to 2020. As you mentioned, Arizona was one of the ones that was somewhat of a surprise if people were looking at it closely, but it certainly, the expectation was that perhaps the Democrats could regain the northern industrial states, Michigan and Pennsylvania. But on Arizona, I would say that things have become a lot more difficult for the Republican Party because they are running candidates that don't have an inclusive message. I think this, to me, it's mind-boggling that, this weekend at a conservative gathering, there's still appetite among the Republican base to continue on with this Trump project, which, as the senator alluded to, seems like a very self-destructive. If you're, as a Democrat, wanted to plant somebody in the Republican Party that was going to allow you to be the majority permanently, you probably would design somebody like Donald Trump with his rhetoric. And I think states like Georgia and Arizona were still probably Republican-leaning states that the Republican Party should have won normally, but it become a lot more competitive because of the divisions within the Republican Party. The fact that we had two Republican senators that were widely admired and broadly speaking were very representative of sort of mainstream Republican values, appealing enough to sort of centrist voters who might go Democratic, but very highly respected in Senators McCain and Flake a few years back. And the fact that the most active base of the Republican Party leading sort of a populist charge against the establishment. And again, it's sort of funny that Senator Flake had become identified with the establishment because that was not where he was originally coming from. But there was sort of an internal civil war within the Republican Party that predates what had been happening nationally in Arizona around the immigration topic. We went through state legislation against immigrants. You know the story very well, Carlos, with our sort of discriminatory state legislation. That was almost 10 years ago, roughly. And and then there was a strong divide within the Republican Party at the state level over that measure, and kind of the Republican, the faction of the party who felt that this was a very not an appropriate stance for the party of Lincoln, not the appropriate stance in a party where the Latino population is the emerging, it's really the key to the future. As my boss, President Crow, says, the future of Arizona depends on how well Latino kids do, just demographics, in a state that borders Mexico to have that kind of message. So I think there was a very corrosive, self-destructive division within the Republican Party that allowed first, we had a Senate race that went Democratic, before 2020. So the signs were all there. And then, as you said, it was still very, very close. But I think a lot of Republican voters were turned off by the rhetoric within their own party. And President Trump managed to really unite Democrats. And that Democrats historically are supposed to be the party that bicker internally, but there was nothing like Donald Trump to unite Democrats. Also you have to applaud efforts to the mobilization efforts. The turnout was just spectacular across the board, nationwide, particularly in a pandemic year and in a high turnout election. That is also going to be, make all the difference.
Andres, I read several reports on how Georgia was flipped, and many of those reports pointed to Stacey Abrams, who ran for governor, as the strategist. And Georgia being a state where the African-American demographic is very strong, Arizona has a 26% of total population is Latino?
It's actually closer to 32%, I believe, but the voting population is low.
That's the thing. So Andres, how did the Latino community, and you're part of that, live this transition? Was there a strategist that you can identify? I mean, we all know that these social movements are not just the responsibility of one person, but I am asking, who were the strategists within the Latino community in Arizona?
There are a lot of grassroots groups in Arizona that were very active in getting out the vote. And again, I don't want to name one or two that come to mind because I'm going to exclude plenty of others. It's true that we don't have as identifiable of a single figure as people think about Stacey Abrams in Georgia, but there are a lot of people who are doing very similar work. And again, it goes back. There was a lot of organization and mobilization that dates back to a lot of what was happening within the state well prior to the Trump phenomenon, which then only keeps that incentivizing going, because as Senator Flake was mentioning, the Latino vote tends to be underrepresented in most states. Obviously you have, if 32% of Arizona's population, roughly speaking, is Latino, maybe 25% are voting age, but then, the registration numbers tend to lag behind that historically, and closing that gap was one of the challenges for Democrats in a lot of these states. And that isn't to say that, we have to be careful not to overgeneralize. There are lots of Latinos in Arizona and elsewhere that voted Republican. So I don't want to overstate the, in Arizona, it leaned a lot more Democratic than in Texas. And those are distinctions that, other experts are better suited to address.
Right. Let me ask you, Senator, and then I'll go back to Daniela Stevens to engage in a binational conversation. Let me ask you, Senator, was it Ronald Reagan who said Latinos are conservatives at heart, only they don't know it? And in this election, I've heard of many Latinos saying, I would vote for Democrats, but then again, Democrats approve of abortion, which is another polarizing issue. So what do you make of that phrase?
Well, I believe that was Ronald Reagan, and he certainly, his message was that, we're the party of opportunity, and our message should appeal to the Latino population. And I think after him, certainly, when I got to Washington, I got there the same time as George W. Bush. George W. got, I think, 43% of the Hispanic vote nationwide. So it certainly is possible for Republicans to do well. But Donald Trump made inroads with certain Hispanic groups, obviously Cuban Americans, but more broadly, not very well. I do think that that's possible, but it has to be a more inclusive message. And when President Trump started out, his campaign talking about the type of people who are coming across the border, and then the federal judge that supposedly could not rule fairly because of his Mexican heritage, making those kind of statements, it's very difficult to catch up after that. But I think Andres, in terms of Arizona and the politics, explained it very well. I should say that Republicans still have about I think it's 200,000 voter registration advantage statewide, and if you run for mine inspector, for example, and we do have a mine inspector, it's a statewide office, just having an R, a Republican, behind your name is usually enough to get you across the finish line if nobody knows, where you stand politically. But if you are, a fervent, disciple or acolyte of President Trump and his kind of politics, then you're likely going to lose statewide, as many of candidates have, the 2 senators. So I think that speaks frankly well for the voters of Arizona, but it's going to be very difficult for Republicans to get these days to get through a primary process and to be able to win statewide. So that's why I think we've really got to change. But I think Andres described the conundrum that Republicans are in pretty well.
Right. Now, before we go into Q&A time, let me go back to Daniela Stevens and ask her about another polarization that is probably outside her academic specialization, but I'm sure she will have a very valuable insight. Another polarization is the gender polarization, men and women. And that is the case worldwide. That is the case in the United States. That is the case in Mexico. From your perspective, Daniela, what do you think that is needed to bridge that?
Well, that's a tough question, Carlos, but I definitely think that it starts at home, number one. Second, it starts at school. Third, it starts in acknowledging our history and the part that women have played in history, maybe not at the forefront of it, but making everything go by smoothly. In terms of climate change, for example, women are leaders of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And it is the case that what is needed is maybe not only gender quotas, but a true broader participation in terms of decision making and in terms of making the rules and deciding who has access to what, defining again what power is in each country. But I also think there is a broader sociological issue to address in terms of women leadership. I recently read a book called Lean In, and it's a very, how could I call it? It's an American book by one of the directors at Facebook, and she talks about the role that we must have as women, because she noticed that we tend to believe that we are underqualified, and unfortunately, she also discovers that sometimes men tend to believe that they are overqualified for exactly the same job with exactly the same qualifications. So we need also a change in mindset, I believe, in all North America.
Right. Thank you, Daniela. Let me now open it up for the audience to engage with our panelists. And I'm going to start with a question to Senator Flake. And I'm going to read it now. Senator Flake, how do you think that polarization has affected the US government's pandemic response? What lessons can be learned for future disaster response?
Well, great. Well, I think in terms of the Congress, and I won't comment too much about the former president or his approach, but the Congress, in responding to the pandemic, has done so in a pretty bipartisan way. If you look at the four, pieces of legislation related to the pandemic that have passed, they've all passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. Right now, we're having a little more difficulty. This latest piece will likely pass as a purely partisan measure. I think that's a shame, because it will obviously impact what goes on in the next couple of years. But I think so far the response from the Congress, at least, has been pretty bipartisan, and that's to Republicans and Democrat credit. So I hope that this piece of legislation that will likely pass the Senate by as early as Friday, I hope that perhaps it's amended sufficiently to bring a few Republicans on board. I'd like to see it be bipartisan. That certainly is better. I mean, with this legislation and just about any kind of legislation, if we want legislation to endure, you know, and that really has bigger impacts if we're dealing with infrastructure, for example, or immigration reform. If we don't want the next administration to come in and just undo it, then we've got to start passing legislation that has at least a modicum of consensus and some bipartisan support. But I think it can and should happen more easily on something like the response to this pandemic.
Thank you, Senator. There's another one for you, and then gonna jump to Andres. Senator, just yesterday, Donald Trump said he intends to contend once again for President of the United States as the Republican candidate in 2024. From your experience and knowledge, both in government and in the Republican Party, do you think Trump has real possibilities of being the GOP's candidate in the next election? Given the situation, shall we expect more division within the party in the next few years, or a broad support from the members of the party?
I don't expect him to be the candidate. Frankly, that performance yesterday, he had to have been a little disappointed. There was a straw poll that was conducted among the attendees at that conference. And you have to remember, those who attended that conference are the firm believers. They are the Trumpiest of the Trumpy. And only 55% of that group actually said that the president should be the candidate. So I think the president would have had to have been disappointed. And then in his remarks, where he kind of hedged, frankly, on whether he would be the candidate or not, he offered nothing new for the party. It was just kind of a recitation of old grievances about the last election. And a lot of the commentary since that speech from Republicans, frankly, and conservatives have been pretty biting in terms of the president's performance yesterday. So I think the president is losing influence. He still has a lot in terms of the party, and candidates are still going to want his endorsement, but that will wane over time, and it will wane in the next 2 years before the midterms, and certainly in the next 4 years, a lot more than that. So no, I don't expect him to be the candidate. I certainly hope that's not the case.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Senator. Andres, I'm from a border state, Tamaulipas. You're from a border state, Arizona. What do you see in terms of, Mexico and the United States working together on the pandemic response, on climate change, and more specifically, Arizona and Sonora working together on these issues?
Yes, and I love Arizona, and I'm thrilled to be here. But I grew up in Chihuahua, so that's another border state too.
Oh,
so
there you go. There you go. So you can discuss several cases.
But it's a good question, because I'm fortunate to be on the board of the Arizona-Mexico Commission, and that is a body that works very closely with Mexican officials and businesses, and particularly in Sonora. That relationship is very close. Unlike, I think, any other two border states, Sonora and Arizona, no matter what's happening in the national capitals, work very constructively together, both at the state governments, the business communities, and so on. And I think it's kind of a model for cross-border collaboration. I do worry that, on this topic of polarization and things that have become polarized that didn't used to be polarized, or overly partisan, I worry that the relationship with the bilateral relationship, the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico, broadly speaking, has become somewhat of a partisan issue. But again, not within the states. And so I think the states can provide some lessons there. I actually, I don't know that Senator Flake probably doesn't know this, but I wrote a column recently in a Mexican newspaper, among other things, saying that it would be great for the Biden administration to name a Republican to be ambassador in Mexico to kind of to sort of broaden to make the bilateral relationship a bipartisan issue from the U.S. perspective. And I might have mentioned your name, Senator.
I did read the initials JF.
Or someone like that book. I think I
somebody who speaks Spanish.
So I think there is. I think we need to get back to. I do worry that the promise of a closer relationship is being lost. I think both Washington and Mexico City in recent years have been going through the motions. They haven't, even at the height or at the lows, I should say, of the Trump administration, the project wasn't abandoned, right? He bashed NAFTA. He ran an entire campaign against Mexico, but he grudgingly, signed a new treaty, which was kind of modernizing NAFTA, and he was able to claim that it was entirely different. And also in Mexico City, you have a nationalist populist leader who also hasn't yet explicitly come to abandon the project. He's not, López Obrador is not saying, everything those neoliberales wanted to do vis-a-vis the United States, we're marcha para atrás, forget it, right? Some of his actions suggest that, but he also signed this treaty, and the two of them obviously had a kind of acomodo where, if the Mexican government did what Trump wanted on immigration, the US government wasn't going to point out or make too much hay out of all these other things the Mexican government was doing that might be amount to a U-turn to a lot of what had been agreed upon, even where it adversely affected the interest of US investors. And so I think now we need a reset in diplomatic terms is kind of a tainted term with a lot of baggage, but we do need sort of a reset in this relationship. And I do worry that there's a disconnect between how closely and constructively the border states work with each other and the current state of the national government's dialogue. It's great that today President Biden and President López Obrador had a conversation, and there's a desire, it seems, to at least optically kind of move in the right direction. I worry that I think that the relationship's always been a complicated one, and you see this even at the state level. It involves so many different agencies, so many different themes, and Washington, I feel like, sometimes doesn't know how to handle the relationship with Mexico because it's not really the State Department. The Secretary of State obviously is the chief diplomatic officer of the United States, but the relationship with Mexico involves everything from whether our electric grids connect, and fishing agreements, and all immigration, security, obviously all of that, right? So every federal U.S. agency is represented in the embassy in Mexico. It's kind of a hybrid role, and Obama picked his Vice President Joe Biden to oversee the relationship through the high-level economic dialogue back in 2013, and so I think I would like to see this administration lift the profile of the relationship and also give oversight of it to coordinate all of these efforts to one person. I would say the vice president, not the son-in-law, as happened in the previous administration.
Right.
Because I think there's just a lot to be coordinated, and I think there's a time now to kind of try to re-engage and set the incentives right for the Mexican government to also start seeing the potential in this closer relationship, and not try, essentially step back, as we're seeing on the energy front, as Daniela mentioned, but also on like security cooperation, and you can go down and if the relationship is just managed in Washington agency by agency, I don't think there's going to be enough leverage or encouragement or incentives on the table for the Mexican government to re-engage, and I think we're just going to see a period of drift.
Right. I do have a couple of follow-up questions for Senator Flake, but before that, I'm going to go to Daniela. There's a question for you here, Daniela. Do you think political polarization on a global level, now we jumped from the national, binational, global level doomed has doomed the international response to climate change?
Thank you for that very insightful question. Fortunately, not at all. The expectation before COP26, the climate summit, COP26, that will take place in Glasgow in next November, they're even higher. Even this renewed hope that there is leadership in the United States, but also because other countries have taken leadership even before Biden took presidency. For example, the United Kingdom announced that it will stop financing fossil fuel projects abroad. China has established zero net emissions for 2050. Japan, South Korea have also set ambitious objectives for reduction of carbon emissions in the long term. And John Kerry, the special envoy for climate, announced that the US would be the host of an international summit on Earth Day on the 22nd of April, in which the US will commit to new specific objectives in climate change. I think that the scenario that President Trump left for the past 4 years left us a little bit with this sensation of doom that you mentioned in the question. And also in our country, in Mexico, we also have the very same, maybe dire vision, but the world is paying heed to these terrible climate catastrophes that are happening and that are putting under stress our electricity systems, our water systems, and our livelihoods.
Let me ask you a follow-up question, Daniela. General Motors has announced that after 2035, they will be no longer making and assembling and selling cars that use fossil fuels. How would that impact the Mexico-US automobile trade?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and that Mexico could take an advantage for it, but I don't know if it will and if it is ready. So some said that General Motors made this commitment because during the Trump administration, General Motors was siding on Trump's side. General Motors wanted to continue the production of regular fossil fuel driven cars, right? But then when Biden took over, General Motors changed its mind, as did BMW and many other companies. They did so because of China, not because of Biden, because China is really getting ahead of the world in terms of manufacturing of electric cars and hybrid cars. So if Mexico doesn't react, it's going to be left behind, and the region as a whole, North America, is going to be left behind. But there is an area of opportunity for sure.
Thanks, Daniela. Let me go back to you, Senator. I have a couple of follow-up questions for you. When you mentioned, when you suggested that Trump will not be the standard bearer of the Republican Party in 2024, is there any chance that Trump will divide the Republican Party and start a new party? Although I know that hopes for a third to be successful have always been doomed in the United States. But is there a sense that Trump could go as far as dividing the party? I mean, there's a great polarization inside the party, but a split, you know, of his followers forming a new party.
Well, he was, it's been rumored that he's been doing some polling, and some of his advisors have talked to him about a new party. Some have suggested he was just using that as leverage to try to keep people like Mitch McConnell or others in line. But no, he stated yesterday that he's not going to create a new party, and I never thought that that was a serious endeavor. Nor is it for others like me, who believe that our party is going the wrong direction. But third parties just have not had a good history in our country. I don't think that's the direction to go. So no, I do think that there is a massive split within the Republican Party right now. I'm hoping that that will heal in a way that points the Republican Party back to its roots: limited government, economic freedom, free trade, strong American leadership. I do think that that's a message that can sell if we will work on trying to persuade people that these are the right principles, rather than complain about past elections or try to suppress the vote, or for people who might be voting for the other side. So I do hope the party can come together, but I hope it comes together in a more inclusive way, a big tent party like we've had before. But I don't think President Trump is going to go off and create another party, no.
Okay, and another question for you, Senator. Dr. Stevens was discussing polarization on a global level. The China issue in the US Senate. There seems to be some sort of bipartisan consensus that China is obviously the main rival that the United States faces at the global level. On, you know, there's talk of a trade war, a technology war, a geopolitical war in the South China Sea, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, I hear the Federal Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, saying we do agree with China on climate change, and Dr. Stevens has discussed the commitment of China for a zero emission economy in a few decades. So what is your sense of that? How is this going to evolve in the Biden administration? Is that going to be an issue that is far from polarizing the Senate and bring together a bipartisan approach?
Well, great. Yes, I do think that that's an area where there can be bipartisan support. You know, over the years, you know, back in the 80s, the 90s, early 2000s, there was pretty much a bipartisan consensus on China that if China was brought into the world economy and under, you know, the same trade agreements and whatnot, that it would democratize. That hasn't happened. That was a you know, a miscalculation really that both parties had. And I think you know, both parties are under the same realization that China is a huge threat. The difference, I think, in the way that the Trump administration approached it, I think they had the right diagnosis that we need to confront China, and that might have to do with tariffs, and we might have to use some sticks that Republicans haven't wanted to use before. But where I think the Trump administration had it wrong is they felt that we could do that alone, that we could offend our allies and then confront China on our own. Where I think there can be bipartisan consensus is to have both parties recognize that we need to work with our allies, particularly our European allies, as a way to you know, have a hedge against China, and that will have to do with technology that China is trying to export, with data flows, privacy issues, those things. We need a consensus, and I think we can get it. I think the Biden administration has put the right people in place on the foreign policy side and national security side, where a bipartisan consensus on foreign policy toward China can be realized. It's still not a given, but it can be.
Right, but let me go back to the beginning of this conversation on immigration, because you told us clearly that you see no green light to a comprehensive reform bill, and you kind of suggested that a piecemeal approach would work better. Is there enough votes for DACA?
No, what I suggested is that we could have, in previous years, taken DACA out, or the DREAM Act as it was before, and we had you know, enough bipartisan support to pass something like that, or a reform of high-skilled visas, for example. That we probably could have done on its own. I don't think any of those would pass on their own today. Certainly with DACA, you're not going to see any progress there until the court, and unless the court, the high court, says that the current program is unconstitutional, and then that would force Congress to address the issue. But as long as it can be kicked down the road, I just don't see that being addressed on its own. You'd still need 60 votes in the Senate, and I don't think you'd have 10 Republicans. Remember, when we did the bipartisan bill in 2013, in the end, there were only 12 or 13 Republicans voting for it. It was unanimous Democratic support, but there were only 12 or 13 of us, and that was a difficult lift to get that many. There aren't that many Republicans. There aren't 10 Republicans now who would, I think, even move on DACA unless the court ruled and Congress had to deal with it. Then I think there's a possibility.
Right. Andres, in this context that the senator just described, how do you see ASU? We were talking about going across the aisle, now across the border. ASU has been very dynamic in reaching out to universities in Mexico, to the private sector, to several different actors. So how do you foresee that, in a context in which legislation at the federal level won't be conducive to greater cooperation?
Well, it's problematic. I mean, on the one hand, we see an opportunity and an obligation to broaden the bilateral relationship and not be so dependent on the sort of government to government dialogue. And certainly, when you look at the U.S.-Mexico relationship, our economies are fairly, they have a very symbiotic relationship, and within corporate America, there's very close ties with their Mexican counterparts. Those of us in the academic sector and in the sort of nonprofit sector need to kind of raise our game. And so, yes, my boss, President Crow, feels emphatically that we need to be more connected with Mexico. We have really good partnerships with CIDE, with Universidad de Guadalajara, with Tec de Monterrey, with UNAM, with a lot of institutions in Sonora that are trying to, ideally, we would have researchers work across the border to solve shared problems. I think that's how President Crow would put it if he were here. We also want to increase the flow of students and learning across border. We have a charter that says that we are, our research and our work needs to be relevant to our community. And we also assume the responsibility for the well-being of our community. And we cannot be a relevant public institution in a state like Arizona and pretend that there's a line there that is the end of the world, and we don't have to worry about what's on the other side of the line, particularly given the fragility of our lovely but challenging desert landscape and environment, and questions of water and the energy. I mean, and we've seen that in other parts of the border in recent weeks and months, where that border is just it's a political line drawn, but the environmental challenges and opportunities are shared. So we need to, we have been vocal in our support of immigration reform to be responsive to our community. We have a very large population of DACA student body, not just from Mexico, and we try to be responsive to them and to our broader Latino population. And one of the things that we've done is we're creating joint programs where our students can avail themselves of the opportunity to get credit by taking online courses at Mexican universities. Mia Armstrong, who coordinates our Convergence Lab, actually did an exchange in Mexico City at the Tec de Monterrey campus for a semester. We have those opportunities, but we're trying to get nimble and smarter in this kind of interconnected distance learning environment where we can provide more and more opportunities for students to take courses at Mexican universities, even if it's online, and vice versa, and thinking about joint degrees and just connecting our students, whether they are of Mexican origin and they can have a more binational academic experience in life, or whether they're students like our friend Mia, who grew up in Flagstaff and discovered Mexico, and it became sort of her great intellectual passion. Those opportunities are really good, and those connections are going to be fundamental for the future well-being of all of North America, because we cannot continue to engage in the kind of politics and cultural warfare that is just really premised on a sort of ignorance of the other and fear and an irrational fear of the other.
Thank you, Andres. Here's a very interesting question for Senator Flake. How many shades of red would you say exist within the Republican Party? Is it just those for Trump and against Trump, or are there multiple internal positions, or just a binary position?
Well, it's certainly not simply those who are against the president and those who are for the president. What you will often hear are Republicans who say we like the president's policies, but we don't like some of his behavior. There are gradations, I'm sure, but it's kind of seen and perceived that it's just you're either for or against. I happen to think that many of the policies that people describe that the president adopted are not very conservative at all. Having said that, you know, the lower taxes, less regulation, strong social
about
conservatism.
President Trump now.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I do think that that we can come together. It's anyone's guess. You know, 2 years is a long time in politics. We just don't know how this will shake out. And a lot will depend, frankly, on what the Democrats do. I think if Joe Biden governs like a moderate, like the moderate that he very much has been over his years, then it'll be very difficult for Republicans being split to gain traction. But if the Democratic Party moves further left, then it'll be easier, frankly, for Republicans to come together and even support a Trump-like candidate again. So I desperately hope that both parties can kind of move toward the center where we've been in the past several years. Let me just say, if I don't have an opportunity after this, how impressive it is what ASU is doing and what they've done for a long time with regard to the relationship with Mexico. These programs, there are just so many, and they're so efficacious and so good for the state. I was always so proud when I was in the Congress to brag about what my state was doing, not necessarily what the legislature was passing with SB 1070, but what with the Arizona-Mexico Commission and cross-border relationships really fostered so much by ASU. It's just really noteworthy and praiseworthy.
We only have a few minutes now, so we're going to begin to wrap up. But Senator, were you by any chance at President Biden's? Were you present at President Biden's inauguration? I
was. I was pleased to be there. It was my sixth inauguration in a row, and I always enjoy it. This was a little different than any I'd been to before. There were far fewer of us, but I was glad to be there.
Let me ask you a personal question. How did it feel to listen to Amanda Gorman, this young African-American, 23-year-old African-American woman? And Daniela, I'm going to go to you with the same question, but the senator was there. You and I watched it on TV. He lived it live, right there on the Capitol steps. How did it feel to listen to her? Because, we've been talking for an hour and a half on polarization, and the words I heard from Amanda Gorman, and I'm going to quote her, just 6 lines. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? We've witnessed a nation that is not broken, but simply unfinished. I think that converges with what you've said, sir. We step out of the shade, for there is always light. if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. How do you feel, Senator?
Well, I can tell you, I had heard she was going to be there. I knew really nothing about her, and I was blown away, as I can tell you, everybody who was there was, and everybody across the country, frankly. It was spectacular. So one of the most memorable parts of that entire day, obviously, and she has a great future. She really does. She brought the country together.
But do you agree with her vision?
Yes, and I think that is a beautiful way to put it. They were not broken, just unfinished. And one thing that I've always felt, and that this started the first day that I went to the Senate back in 2013, where I went to the National Archives, and we were allowed to go into the legislative vault and look at all the relics of the country over the years, back from the Revolutionary War to the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement to women's suffrage. And I had the feeling there, and that's never left me, that we have been through some very difficult times, and we've come through it. And we can get past this highly polarizing time that we're in now, if we'll just work together. And I think that we can, we have to, and we will.
Thank you, Senator. Daniela, how did it feel listening to and viewing, Amanda Gorman?
Well, it was heartwarming and definitely astonishing and inspiring. But I think that if Amanda Gorman were here, she would take, it's very good that you're inspired by me, that you agree with my vision, but what I'm here is for inspire you to take action. So listen to me, but let's deal hands-on, and let's be uncomfortable with issues like race. Let's get uncomfortable with issues like climate change, and let's take personal and social responsibility for that. Not tomorrow, now.
Thank you, Daniela. Well, I want to ask Andres to give us, the final remarks. But before that, I want to give special thanks to the CIDE team who has organized this conversation, to Maria Jose, to Luis, to Mario, to Dr. Blanca Heredia, to our president, Sergio Lopez Ayllón, and to the very dynamic team at ASU Convergence Lab, particularly Mia Armstrong, who did fantastic preparatory work for this. And in this, please, Andres, you have the final words.
Well, I would thank everybody, and I would, I like ending on, it's hard to follow Amanda Gorman. That's a hopeful note. And I think we all need to be reminded that how we disagree with each other in our own lives makes a difference in terms of the collective, polarization or non-polarization. It's easy to say, like, well, our representatives far away in our capitals, are supposed to behave one way, but we're going to behave differently. And you see this on how we talk to each other, even on like social networks, where people just get a little bit crazy. Yesterday I saw a former boss of mine who runs New America, the think tank, offered a very, interesting policy view. I forget even what it was. She's a very constructive thinker, and just put out an idea. And a very well-known journalist, who's sort of a public figure, tweeted back at her, "Have you lost your mind?" And that kind of really shocked me. And it's just like, it's a recent example that comes to mind of like, and people didn't seem to make that much of it. And I just kind of put my phone down, and I need to go take a walk. And like, there's something toxic in how we disagree with each other, that, we need to kind of look inside ourselves, and not just, cast stones at our political figures, because they are kind of a mirror of some of our own behaviors. I can remember long before Trump, people on the far left would call lots of Republicans fascist, and people on the Conservative Party, in the Republican Party, conservatives would call people like Bill Clinton and Obama like socialists. And it was sort of nonsensical, but that was the kind of hyperbole of how we disagree with each other. And then Trump comes along, and part of me felt like, you know, we have turned our hyperbolic rhetoric into reality. Like, okay, now we might actually have a fascist, like, because this is what we've, so, you know, that would just be another note I would add, but mostly I really enjoyed the conversation, and thanks to everybody who watched this.
Well, thanks, Senator. It's been an honor.
Thank you. Thank all of you.
Thanks, Daniela. Y muchas gracias a todos los que nos siguieron en México, en Arizona y en otras partes. A nombre del CIDE, muchísimas gracias por su participación. Buenas noches a todos.
Buenas noches.
Gracias por acompañarnos en esta segunda temporada de Conversaciones CIDE, un espacio de diálogo para tratar de entender desde miradas plurales. Los esperamos el próximo lunes a las 8 de la noche.